Trump is a disaster. India had 5 partitions. India grows at night when the government's asleep.
The West is being eclipsed.
Globalisation model is disappearing.
Colonial hangover in Westminster.
1.4 billion people will simply be ignored. Trump's attack on Iran was an act of extraordinary stupidity. Somebody uses the nuclear weapon, the Middle East will settle into a quiet backwater. The United Nations can't do anything. India is now a significantly bigger power in many ways than Britain and France. India made one big mistake.
This is India, a story in the making, and I'm your host, Lavina Tandon. Hello and welcome to India, a story in the making. Today I am with someone who predicted the 2008 crash in 2005, and now he has predicted that the West is being eclipsed by 2 major countries, India and China. Sir Vince Cable. Thank you so very much for being a part.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. I don't have to say too much about Sir Vince. Everyone knows he has led Lib Dems and has been the business secretary in the very tough time in the country. He has actually started as Labour councillor. But I did not know, sir, that you were a nurse as well. And that's where your India connection really started.
Yes, I in my final year as a student, I went to nurse in a mental hospital, and I met this wonderful, beautiful woman in the lounge, as you do, and we got married a year later. She was from Kenya, Indian heritage, and that really started my involvement in India going back 60 years.
So you've been to India on and off and with her.
Well, I first went actually without her. When I was a student, I went with some friends in a van, and we drove through the Soviet Union and Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan to India. And I was then on my own, and I drove this van from Ahmedabad to, I think, somewhere like Patna, exploring in the middle of India, discovering there weren't any bridges across the rivers, amongst other things. A great adventure. But I loved being there, and I really wanted to go back. And when I married Olympia, we had every pretext because our family settled in Goa after the problem with the Kenyan nations. And been going back ever since on family reasons, but also research, business. I wrote for many years for The Economist on India. And when I became a British cabinet minister responsible for trade, I went back, I think, 4 times on official missions to negotiate. And before that, I was in Shell. I was there in group planning and the chief economist, and I was sent out to India to do an evaluation about whether Shell should risk, billions of pounds of shareholders' money in a country that then, in the mid-90s, was not considered very friendly to overseas business.
So how many times have you been to India? Have you been
I think
countless?
about 25.
But for this book, which I have made notes on, it is absolutely wonderful. And it is so informative. It is backed by data. It's been considered something that is a Bible of the current times in India's foreign policy. So how many times did you go for this book?
Well, several times, but of course the 2 central countries in my story are China and India. I came to China actually much later. Again, I was working with Shell. They asked me to go and do evaluation for them. I dealt with the Chinese when I was in the coalition government. But I don't speak Mandarin. It's a vast country and a more difficult country in many ways than India. So I've been building up my connections there. I now have a link with a couple of Chinese universities, Shenzhen particularly. And I've become a Chinese social media influencer, believe it or not. I don't think I can compete with you, but my Hongshu account, the Little Red Note account, is, I think, over 100,000. So and that helps me to understand China better because I get a sort of feedback from my Chinese audience. And the fact that I'm able to say pretty much what I want goes a bit against the caricature of China as some extreme closed country. There are lots of restrictions. It is authoritarian, but it's actually possible to have very good conversations and dialogue with people in China as you do in India.
Yes, indeed. I think you should have one on India's channel as well, since this book is releasing soon in India as well.
Yes, Juggernaut are publishing it as an Indian edition, and I was at the Jaipur Book Festival talking about it, so I think there's already an interest in India, and I certainly want to take that forward.
Now that we are already in the arena of the book, can I begin by asking, when you say West, eclipsing the West, who do you mean, or who's in the West Club?
Yes, I'm not talking about this in kind of civilizational terms, just as an old-fashioned economist. It's essentially North America, Western Europe, plus Japan. I mean, Japan, of course, isn't culturally Western, but we see it as part of the advanced, in quotation marks, the rich world. And so I'm contrasting that with the big emerging economies. And the big shift, which is actually the core of my argument, is that the West, defined in the way I have, accounted for by 60% of the world economy in 1990, the end of the Cold War, big turning point in modern history. It's now down to 40%. Basically, what's happening is that initially China, and particularly China, but now India, taking up a growing proportion of the rest. So the world economy, the center of gravity of the world economy has moved to Asia, and it's dominated by these two superstates, as I call them. They account for a significant part of the world's population, 1.4 billion each. And India is not a superpower, right? It doesn't have military projection. It's not remotely comparable to the US and China. But it is what I call a superstate simply by virtue of its scale and its expanding scale and its diversity. And what we see in a kind of extraordinary ways in which these two enormous countries have managed somehow to capture all the benefits of scale while remaining together as a sort of cohesive state. It's done in very different ways, of course, in the Chinese with the dominance of the Communist Party, in India in a much more pluralistic environment. But nonetheless, they've held together. And they're now beginning to reap the advantages of simply being very, very big. Because if you have a world which is fragmenting, which is what is happening in the world, the globalisation model is disappearing to some extent. Being self-sufficient but outward-looking, that combination is a very powerful one. And these are the only two countries, apart from the United States, that can think of the world in that way. I mean, maybe the European Union, but it no longer functions as a cohesive unit.
I do want to go through the concept of civilisational state, as you call India and China.
One of the fundamental underpinning political issues in both countries is how do you hold together a country of such enormous scale and diversity? And I think in both cases it's reaching they're both grounded in great histories. The last century wasn't great because the Indians were colonized and China was humiliated, but going back over the centuries, both of these countries have a rich history of civilization. And if we look at the economic numbers, and there are some rather smart people who go back to the days of the Roman Empire, who established that throughout these 20 centuries or more, what is now called India, different configurations in the past, and what is now called China, were in many ways the dominant economies in the world. Of course, they weren't joined up. I mean, we didn't have the current structures, but one little fact I picked up was in the days of the Roman Empire, a large part of government finance was derived from import duties on goods from India. They had a massive influence going back over centuries. India particularly has waxed and waned, and they've foreign conquests, but nonetheless there's this deep underpinning of a civilization and the rediscovery of being a great power, which is what both of these countries are now becoming.
Having the kind of civilizational support that India has had, and the kind of, because how to do politics, how to live your life, how to dance, what is health, all of it. How does that play into India's cultural mind of taking decisions? Is there anything at play, and has it kept the country together? Do you think that is the glue?
Well, of course, India started off, modern India in 1947, in a bad way. I mean, we'd had partition. It wasn't just one partition. India had 5 partitions. It lost not just Pakistan, but Burma before that, and Nepal. India, or what was British India, it used to occupy the Persian Gulf. And all these places like Dubai and Kuwait were once part of India in the Raj days. So there was repeated amputation. And so holding India together after that with the initial pulls factors, the difficulties in Hyderabad, for example, the growth of a Tamil movement, the issues in the Punjab. I mean, holding all that together within a broadly democratic framework is a phenomenal achievement. And India has a great kind of underlying strength because of the way to manage this diversity. I sometimes make an analogy that China's a bit like cast iron. Phenomenally strong, but under extreme pressure could crack. Whereas India is a bit like wrought iron. It's also strong, but it bends. And I think that over the decades to come, that will prove to be a significant positive, because there are strains and stresses. We know at the moment, the Hindi-speaking north, there is an element of alienation in the south, different language, not wanting to be captured by the Hindutva philosophy. So there is this diversity of experience and ethnicity which has to be managed. But India's done it brilliantly well, and I say my book is essentially positive about the future.
India, the way with its diversity, with the kind of differences it had, would survive. It would disintegrate. Is that true? Was that thought there in somewhere here?
Well, somehow it has survived. I think one of the downsides initially was that the democratic process made economic reform very difficult. Too many vested interests initially. The landlords who resisted land reform, and the protected industrialists who resisted liberalisation. And in a democratic system, that's quite difficult to manage. But
and you mentioned farmers as well.
Yes, but the beginning of the 90s, I think Manmohan Singh, who deserves to go down as a really great figure in modern history, with his reforms, and which is subsequently built on, and we've been built on again. So you've now got a country growing at 7% plus. And compound interest is a very powerful thing. And if this is sustained for 2 more decades to the mid-century, India then has an economy roughly the same size as the United States. That's why I talk about superstates.
What do you think are the real factors that are the biggest positives of India, and then the challenges? How can it retain what it's doing and be the 2050 superstate, as you're saying?
There's a phenomenal entrepreneurial energy in India, even though there is still an enormous swathe of regulation and government unfriendly, ways of dealing with business. You get an enormous entrepreneurial energy from the bottom up. That's essentially what's been driving growth. I mean, there is this wonderful expression that India grows at night when the government's asleep. And in many ways, that captures much of the dynamism that we've seen. And as the state becomes more open and reformist, which I think is broadly the case, I could expect to see that energy growing. And it's coupled with the fact that you're now getting a competent infrastructure. I mean, when I first went to India, you had to spend a weekend queuing for a telephone call, and the roads were hopeless, and the airports were a disaster, and the ports didn't move. There was on strike. I mean, but all of that's changed. You've now got super modern infrastructure. You've got this Aadhaar digital system, which is connecting everybody. So the combination of functioning infrastructure, entrepreneurial energy, and basic political stability, that's a very powerful combination, and why I'm sort of fundamentally an Indian optimist.
The challenges?
India made one big mistake, which was in the course of economic development, which is just missing out on that whole period of industrialization through trade, which the Chinese have done. The effect of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, starting in the 80s, effectively attracting inward foreign investment, but exporting to the world and focusing on being taking full advantage of globalization's opportunities. Of course, India never did that, and its manufacturing sector is therefore weak, protected, not particularly internationally competitive. That's the big mistake, but I think there's now an understanding of that in India, and the beginnings of attempts to correct that mistake.
Do you feel, which I thought I read as well, I thought that's what you meant, that there is reform but not enough because of the democratic forces and diverse democratic forces pulling it down?
Yes, I mean, radical economic reform is difficult, and as the Chinese discovered, I mean, we tend to forget now that the Tiananmen Square massacre was a response to a nationwide uprising. Effectively, it was massive disturbances across China, which were not primarily about demanding democracy. There was an element of that, but it was primarily a protest against the freeing of prices. It had to happen to go from being a communist planned economy to a more market-based economy. They opened up prices, inflation shot through the roof, people started rioting. In China, they were able to deal with that, rather brutally, but they were able to manage. You can't do that in India, right? When there is objection to, as there was a couple of years ago, to agricultural reform, people come on the streets. The government can't shoot them. It's televised. It's even though there are restrictions on the media. It's very open. You have to accommodate. You have to take things a bit more slowly. And that's going to continue to be true. But having a democratic system is ultimately a great strength in giving that flexibility and adaptability and getting feedback to the government when they make a mistake. You hear about it through the ballot box. The Chinese don't have that. So it does slow down the pace of reform. But you can manage it, and it has been managed.
Do you think it is going to be the tortoise world versus a hare analogy for China?
Yeah, well, we're seeing that now. I mean, the Chinese hare is now, well, I wouldn't say it's asleep, but certainly much subdued, because the Chinese have got two very serious problems. They invest too much, and a lot of it's wasted. There's a very low return on a lot of their investment. This may change with these new technologies, but so far they've been investing too much and wasting it. They've also had a collapse in their property market. People have been impoverished. Middle-class people have lost a lot of their wealth. They're also having to save because there isn't a health service of any kind, effectively. So you're getting a classic capitalist-type downturn in China, what I call a crisis of capitalism, the weak demand. And the Chinese are really, really struggling with that. So the hare is, if not dead, certainly switching off. At precisely the time when India is moving forward very rapidly.
Do you think through these trade deals, India is opening up a bit more? Is it looking at its manufacturing, the whole Made in India concept? And which one do you think is most exciting for you?
Well, it is a sign of opening up, and it is welcome. I don't make too much of these trade deals, actually, because in a way it's a sign that the world economy is malfunctioning. I mean, until recently, the world was opening up through the World Trade Organization. Almost every country was removing its trade barriers. There was no discrimination, because that was the world that the Chinese took advantage of. Their phenomenal leap forward in trade industrialization, because the world was open. Now we're getting Trump tariffs and restrictions in other countries, less so in Europe, but certainly the Trump tariffs. And countries are trying to manage this through bilateral deals. The European Union's doing it, the British are doing it, and India's doing it. And it's a palliative. It's actually, it's not great that the world economy is fragmenting in this kind of way. But I think in India's case, it's not just making the best of a bad job, but it's also a signal of opening up, a willingness to engage. It's not as radical as we saw in China, and it needs to go further. But yeah, it's opening up markets at home and abroad, and that's welcome.
Trump came with MAGA, making America great, and making dollar stronger, but has had his tariffs, his policy, the way he's going, has had an opposite impact. And the groupings of even India, China are meeting now. And UK has went to China.
Trump is a disaster, absolute disaster for the world and for the United States. I mean, it's the degradation of American democracy. There's massive corruption now with the Trump family. It's an appalling situation. But it's also, very bad for the world. I mean, what Trump has done has been to destroy alliances and coalitions of like-minded countries that have grown up over many years. I mean, it's extraordinary that the British, who are of all the countries, or Canada, the closest to the US, are now desperately trying to get away from being dominated by the United States. India was developing positive relationships with the Americans and increasingly saw America as a source of security and support. And Trump deals with India by slapping on tariffs and increasing visa restrictions on highly qualified Indians. I mean, it's a complete inability to deal properly with your friends. And it's certainly a setback for India, but it's not, of course, terminal. And Trump won't be there forever.
Yeah, that's the only respite. But him coming at NATO, him coming at UN, do you think NATO and UN have done the job that they were meant for, or they needed an evolution and Trump has given that shake-up goal?
Yes, you're correct in me in a sense, pointing out that intentionally or unintentionally, Trump has actually done a few positive things, and one of which was the wake-up call for the Europeans that they couldn't just rely on American protection forever. They've got to be a bit more self-reliant in defense. I think that message has got through, and that's fine. But the damage that Trump is doing to international institutions is much worse, because the world did rely on governance institutions, to put it a bit pompously, the United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, the International Climate Forum for negotiations on emissions, human rights. Trump has trashed the lot and destroyed, or is destroying, the kind of framework of cooperation which you need, because there are a lot of things that the world has in common. We do need to deal with the climate emergency as a planet, not the series of individual countries. Nuclear proliferation, protecting the seas, Antarctica, space. They need global rules, or artificial intelligence, as India has demonstrated, needs global rules. And when you have the leader of the currently most powerful superpower trashing it all, it's very disruptive.
But he was voted into power. There must be something. Do you think what he's trying to do is to save the dollar somehow, and in the process has hurt it more? I want to make sense of what he's trying to do.
Well, it is certainly the case that one of the very strong assets that the Americans have is the use of the dollar as a global currency. And it has two big advantages for them. The first of all, it enables them to run much bigger deficits in their budget than other countries could get away with, like the British. because, the world will buy American treasuries to finance it, and they will hold dollars. And the other advantage is they can impose sanctions on countries they don't like, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, India, China to some extent, to Russia and China to some extent. So the idea that Trump is saving the dollar is a bit strange to me, because people are gradually moving away from holding dollars. It's not destroying its hegemony on the international exchange system, but it's weakening it. More and more central banks are moving their reserves into gold or European currencies or Japanese yen. They're not doing renminbi and dollar and rupees, but they're diversifying. So over time, Trump is, I think, chipping away at the enormous power that having the dollar as a global currency conveyed for them.
The dollar really declining, that has also contributed, in your mind, to the declining of the West.
Yes, if you're looking at the management of the United States, you can see that they're not running their economy responsibly. They've got rapidly rising levels of debt, public debt, and they've got a very large deficit on their budget, which should be closed and isn't being closed. There isn't any kind of fiscal discipline. So why would you want to hold dollar in the long run? And I think anybody looking at this in a global sense would see that the Chinese now have complete dominance of manufacturing supply chains, and they're also overtaking the United States in key technologies. India really isn't yet part of that conversation, but probably will be. So I think most people looking at the big global picture can see gradually, economic and technological power shifting as part of what I call the eclipse of the West. And that feeds into the worries that Trump is creating through his unpredictable behavior.
Britain holds 6 gold of 63 countries. Does that make Britain in a positive situation in any shape or form?
One of the things that happened 30 years ago is that Gordon Brown sold off a lot of gold reserves. Actually, it may not have been very well timed, but it was quite sensible.
Really?
Yes. I know there is a move into gold, but it's not actually very rational when you think about it. Gold is useless. What can you do with it? I know a lot of Indian women wear jewelry, but it doesn't actually produce a return. The only return you get is if the price keeps rising. So as a speculative asset in the short run, it has some advantages. It's much more sensible to hold assets which produce a return. But unfortunately, holding the United States Treasury is seemingly less attractive than holding gold, even though gold isn't very productive.
Wow, this is an economist who's saying, to an Indian, not holding gold is just not a given.
Yeah.
It's like their safety net. And I think it's built into the cultural mindset.
Well, I think in Britain, it's not gold, it's property.
It's property, yes.
And even that market is looking a bit fragile.
I'm sorry, one digression. It seems now people, the younger generation, say that it's not property. It's stupid to hold property. It should be shares or investment. Do you agree with that?
Well, the property market in the UK has got completely out of control, out of balance. For many, many decades, the price of houses had a fairly stable relationship to people's income. And so a young couple on a fairly average income could seriously think about borrowing for a mortgage and buying a house. But the price of housing in relation to people's earnings is now about 3 or 4 times what it used to be. So that you can't plan your life on the basis that you're going to own a home, unless the bank of mum and dad comes to the rescue.
Yeah.
So you're producing a generation of people who are not property owners.
Yes.
And that's got political implications in the UK. And also, well, maybe it's making us more continental, because across a country like Germany, it was never thought to be sensible. You just take out a long rental.
Yes, I think that's the way the world is going, longer rentals and shares. I more and more I speak to investment bankers. Frenemies.
What I mean by frenemy, the enemy stuff is easy to describe because there is this long frontier. India fought a humiliating war in 1962. And a more recent clash on the frontier. I mean, India sees China as a security threat, partly because it's a bigger power. It's got more sophisticated weapons, and there's a very long frontier. So that's very easy to understand the frenemy bit. And of course, China has supported Pakistan and provided the Pakistan Air Force with sophisticated flights. And so if you're sitting in India, it's very difficult to see China in any other than threatening adversarial terms. But there are areas where they have a lot in common. In their approach to reforming world institutions, because India is shut out of key decision makings in the World Bank, the IMF. They're not properly represented. They ought to be on the Security Council as a permanent member, but India isn't. They have a common view on climate change. They know they have to move very rapidly to renewables. It's happening in China, in India to a lesser extent. They're both highly dependent on coal. There are areas where they actually are in a common position and work together, and that's what I call the friend bit. Trade is more ambiguous. I think a lot of Indian industrialists and policymakers realize that China's got quite a lot to offer India in terms of technology, but equally it doesn't want to be completely dominated by Chinese products, which are competitive across the board and would probably wipe out some of the more fragile Indian industries if they were exposed to competition. So there's a peculiar sort of mixture of motives. And I don't sense that there's a lot of empathy, actually. I go to China and I tell them, look, you should really take India more seriously. And they say, really? They can't understand how this messy country, it's just chaotic. They can't understand how it can be a major power. And I try to explain, but they don't buy it. And I try to talk to my Indian friends and say, well, look, there are reasons for dealing with the Chinese. They're not monsters. You can have a good pragmatic relationship with them, and they don't buy that either. So it's more enemies than friends at the moment, is what I sense.
Yes. I think the trust factor.
Yes, the trust is very low.
It's very, very low with China. But trust with regards to China is low of the UK as well. UK doesn't trust China as much.
It's mixed. There are people like me who say, actually, we should engage with China. I take what I think would be a business view, that when you're looking at a proposition like engagement with China, there are threats, and you have to ignore the threats is to be naive, but there are also opportunities, and to ignore the opportunities is foolish.
Yes.
So you've got to get that balance right.
You have mentioned how it was not correct for Hawaii to be shut down. There's such a big hue and cry about the spy thing and the Chinese embassy.
Well, there are a few people who are obsessed with this. There's a cluster of mainly conservative MPs, and they seem to have some friends in the security establishment, and they're endlessly making these stories in the press about Chinese spies. You have to be aware of espionage and cybersecurity. These things are very important, and I would 100% support the security services when they crack down on them. But the idea that people are a spy because they talk to a Chinese official, I mean, a lot of this is schoolboy stuff. And we've really got to be more realistic about it.
Were you okay with this whole idea of big Chinese, mega Chinese embassy?
If there is a genuine security, I mean, I'm not familiar with all the technology around pipes and cyber and so on, but the security services would have vetoed it, but they didn't. And I think a lot of the accusations is sort of paranoia, to be frank.
Do you think that China was a smooth and a silent operator and the West kept on dumping the work they didn't want to do?
I don't think it's complacent. The idea that the most populous country in the world, which it then was, India is now caught up, but 1.4 billion people will simply be ignored or kept out, was just ludicrous. I mean, China, particularly when it started to modernize and reform, was going to be a big player. It made obvious sense for the American leadership, and we're talking the Bushes and Clinton, that era. It made sense to engage with them and to look at the advantages of engaging with China, which were very substantial. I mean, China's influence on the world economy has ferocious competition, but also contributed massively to that period of stability that we enjoyed until the financial crisis. So it's been pluses and minuses. The position we've now got to is that the Chinese no longer operate simply on the basis of low labor costs. I mean, it's a very sophisticated industrial economy, and industrial supply chains far more advanced now than you see in the West, and that's the reality. And you can't somehow shut the doors on all of this. What is happening, of course, is that China has a very unbalanced economy. They're exporting too much because they have weak domestic demand. And that's why trade barriers are going up, not just in America and Europe, but in many of the emerging markets. The Chinese, if they're intelligent, and they are, will avoid getting into a position where they antagonize the rest of the world. So they've got to rebalance their economy. But once they've done that, they're a big player, and we've got to deal with them.
Can you trust the Chinese?
I don't think it's a question of deviousness. They say what they mean, and they mean what they say. I mean, actually, they're extremely straightforward. They don't pretend to be Mother Teresa. These the Chinese business guys are tough, ruthless, but they want to do deals, and people dealing with them should go into it with that.
Why then China has some border dispute or the other? Why do they go into, let's say, places like Sri Lanka, Africa, give them money and almost take it as their port? What are they trying to do then?
I think a mixture of things. One of the reasons for the heavy investment that they made in Africa, or Chinese companies and banks, I should say, not government directly, was a mixture of access to raw materials, reliable supplies of key raw materials, and the market for Chinese products, manufacturing products, and increasingly for telecommunication systems. You could say it's a bit like the old-fashioned British imperialism in the 19th century, except in the Chinese case, they don't do it with guns, they do it with trade. It's clearly self-interested, but if in the process they build up Africa's infrastructure and help them to develop, well, it's a two-way process.
But they take the part of their land.
Yes. Well, India is now doing the same thing. I mean, India is more popular in Africa because it's seen as being a bit less pushy and less powerful. But India is developing its own version of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. And because you've got the Aadhaar system, which is very effective and a very good way of countering poverty, I think a lot of African countries are buying into it.
India is making India. America wants to make itself great. China is ready to. Yes, everyone is looking at their interests. Yet the world after World War II is very interconnected. We are depending on manufacturing on China. 80% of the world's oil is being processed in China, even if it's procured from somewhere else. India is the global capacity center. It's the digital backbone of the world. And Taiwan is that of semiconductors. So we can't operate our lives without depending on each other. And yet in the Iran war, we are stuck. How do we make sense?
Trump's attack on Iran was an act of extraordinary stupidity, just not thinking through the consequences. I think it would have been possible some years back to have reached some accommodation with the Iranians about their nuclear development. Obama's agreement was something that I think most Europeans felt was as good a deal as could be expected. But Trump never accepted that. And they've got into a position where Iran is an enemy. But what they're now painfully discovering is they're simply dropping bombs on them doesn't solve any problems, because you've got an asymmetric warfare where a country, even though it's physically been destroyed by bombs, can do a great deal of damage by hitting the world economy. I don't know, frankly, what the way out now is, because either the Americans keep going to try and destroy the regime, but that's going to be very difficult. There's going to involve ground troops taking over things like the Cargill and refineries and so on. The Trump isn't going to be able to do that politically. Or they just walk away, in which case the Iranians will have won.
That's not possible in Trump's ego.
Yeah, well, so, it's very difficult to see a good way out of this now.
We are in a mess.
A terrible mess, I'm afraid.
Oh, God.
And maybe this is where the Europeans should exert themselves a bit more. And China and India, actually, which together are the main consumers of Middle Eastern oil, have a vested interest in stability and are being damaged. Both China and India are being damaged by this disaster.
What do you think they could do?
Well, we've got to, I think, just stop the bombings. I mean, we can't change the regime in Iran, so dropping bombs on them. It's just going to work. There is going to have to be some form of coexistence with the regime and some lifting of sanctions on very clear understandings that they don't develop their nuclear weapons program. But that is taking us back to where we were a few years ago.
The counter argument is that they always, through this dialogue, buy time and do not do.
Well, that is the argument, and that's what the Israelis argue. But
Yes.
what else? What else do you do?
In a position to just not meddle in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran. Why Gates people?
Because of oil and gas.
Yeah.
And it's created these artificial states based on artificial wealth. It's created massive inequality. It's created a heavy level of dependence on the Middle East. Both India and China, and this is where they have a common interest, have got a wake-up call that they just have to stop being so dependent on imported hydrocarbons, and that means moving even more rapidly to renewable energy, to renewables. Of course, coal is a transitional fuel, hopefully not for too long.
Yeah.
But it's a big shock to them and to Europe as well. We've just been very complacent and haven't moved quickly enough into what's called the energy transition. And when the world ceases to be dependent on Middle Eastern oil, maybe the Middle East will settle down into a quiet backwater. But that's some way off. The rent that they derive from their oil, which is the source of the wealth in that region, but also a source of dispossessed people. One of the ironies of this war, we haven't seen it yet, but I fear that it's going to seriously destabilize some of the more settled countries. We haven't heard anything from Egypt, but Egypt is potentially one of the most damaged countries from the economic fallout from this war. Pakistan is another, but it's not quite Middle East. So I'd say that there are going to be more explosions to come.
Now, yes, of course, and we fear that every morning. If you've not heard the news for 4 hours, you wonder what's happened.
Move quite quickly now to the UK. Now, whatever Sir Keir Starmer is Prime Minister is doing, do you think he's on the right track?
On this particular issue, I mean, there's a more general question about the performance of the British government. But if you take this handling of the Middle East crisis, I think Starmer's been absolutely right. I think he will get a lot of credit in the long term from the fact that he didn't join in this unprovoked attack on Iran. I mean, of course, it's an awful regime. There's no problem about that. But there was no need to attack them. But they did, and all the fallout has come from that. And the British distanced themselves. They're absolutely right. But at the same time, we are horribly dependent on the United States. When the independent nuclear deterrent isn't independent, it's leased from the US. And there is a very strong interdependence through investment and trade, and we can't just pretend it doesn't exist. I don't regard it as a special relationship. It may be special for the British, it isn't for the Americans, but we have to have a good working relationship with them. And Starmer has, has accepted a bit of humiliation in order to maintain working relationships with the Trump administration. So he's been dealt a very bad hand, but has played it, I think, well enough.
The biggest bane of, I think, Starmer's life you have dealt with. He left the office and you joined Peter Mandelson. How was the office left? What is your view?
Mr. Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, I think he still is, was my predecessor. So I inherited good and bad things, and he did leave behind the beginnings of an industrial strategy, which was actually very positive. But the negative things, he had seriously alienated some of our investors, Indian investors actually, and I had to repair some of the damage. But of course, this whole Epstein controversy is awful. The one positive thing I would say about it is that, unlike the United States, the UK has actually taken action on Mandelson and Prince Andrew. There's a lot more to be done, but people have been held into account for what is appalling behaviour. How far it will go, we don't know. But at least under the British system, we're not corrupted. Our democratic system and our legal system still maintain their basic integrity, and we go after people who behave badly, and that's no longer the case in the United States.
But he was hired, and he knew that he'd stayed in his hotel house.
Starmer's acknowledged that he made a mistake and appointed him. He was probably badly advised, but he made a mistake. He's acknowledged that he's made it. You make mistakes in positions of power. I've never been Prime Minister, but at the next level down, I made mistakes. We all do. Yeah. You're under pressure of events. You're being required to make big decisions one after another on the basis of limited facts. So you make mistakes, and that is one of his mistakes. But it's not, in my view, that's not terminal.
Prince Andrew, since you mentioned, you did sit on the same table at the time when he was envoy.
Which was not a very important category of people, but there are about 30 MPs and others who, in a semi-voluntary way, were there to promote British exports. I had very little to deal with him. I went once to Buckingham Palace to talk about his role, but I didn't have a great deal to do with him. It became very clear shortly after I got my office that he couldn't continue, and I made it very clear that he shouldn't continue. And then the Prime Minister took this was 2012, took the necessary action to speak to the Queen and strip him of that role. We didn't know all the facts around the Epstein scandal. There were rumours that Andrew was a bad boy and didn't behave and was a bit greedy and not very helpful to the country. But it was sort of rumours, innuendo, and that we didn't really know the background.
So him not being the envoy, did you have anything to do with it?
Yeah, in a small way. I was asked on television if I still had confidence in him, and I wasn't willing to show confidence in him. So that may have contributed to his losing the role.
Peter Mandelson, you took over from him. Was that frenemy?
He was a very controversial character. Gordon Brown, who was actually Prime Minister of great integrity. I mean, lots of people didn't like him, but he was in many ways a fine man, and he obviously made a bad mistake bringing Mandelson back. But he's acknowledged it, just as Starmer has, that he made a mistake. And Mandelson was quite a seductive character. I mean, he was a good talker, he was very plausible, a good schmoozer, and got into places he shouldn't have done.
How do you see the world now? In 2050, world for Sir Vince Cable?
We can't predict the future, but we can tell stories about how the future will emerge. And the story we're currently in is a kind of downward spiral. in which conflict is feeding on itself, institutions are being weakened at a global level, and unless we arrest that, there will be a disaster, either a serious economic crash or climate disaster, somebody uses the nuclear weapon, all kind of things. So there is a really urgent need to focus on how we attack these big global problems in a positive way. And countries like India and the UK, middle powers, if you like, are the countries that need to be doing it. Canada's been setting an example, and other places like Japan, the French, Germans, which are not superstates, not superpowers. That's where the initiative lies, and we've really got to be proactive, because otherwise this downward vortex is going to be horrible. A more optimistic picture is that we survive this Trump-driven crisis, and what will then gradually emerge is that we get into a system of 3 superpowers, 3 superstates, maybe with Europe, if Europe gets its act together and Britain re-engages, and that's some way off at the moment. And the big challenge will be how these 3 countries, which are frenemies, manage to recreate a world order which replaces the system which was basically driven by the United States and the West. That era is over, but we need somebody to put in its place.
And the 3 things are the US, India and China.
Yes, and hopefully the European Union. And some, important middle powers, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, they need to have an important role.
So we're really talking of a very multipolar world.
Yes,
and
you've got the word.
And you expressed your worry that in a multipolar world, who is going to look after the world?
Yeah, exactly. And you've summarized it extremely well. So it's not just a question of managing from day to day. It's a question of thinking very clearly about how we create a new set of global rules and institutions which reflects this changing balance, where what the world economy and technology was originally centered on the Western world, and also political models and values and so on, and that's now shifted. And the order that emerges is going to reflect that shift.
In this world order, how do you see the role of NATO, UN, the big institutions that look after the world evolving? What do they need to do to keep the world intact?
The United Nations in itself can't do anything, because it's how the powers use it.
But it doesn't do anything much.
Well, it doesn't do anything because the big powers don't let it do anything.
Yes, but
it does need a re-injection of energy and political commitment, which is why, starting at the top, the Security Council needs to be reformed. Countries like India need to be actually in the middle of it. India is now a significantly bigger power in many ways than in Britain and France, so why are they in and India isn't? So you need a restructuring at the Security Council level, and you need to build up, rebuild the credibility of organizations like the World Trade Organization. The climate change process, the IPCC, struggles along. If it works, that will be primarily China and India, or mainly China at the moment. So at individual institutional level, even in a multipolar world, you can expect, or hopefully, if people are positive, some governance, some order that gets us through some of the horrible crises that are looming on the horizon.
Yes. What is India doing right, and what it needs to continue to do right in order to become that superpower in 2050?
India is doing a lot of things right, and it's, despite all the pressures, it's a politically stable country. Its economic policy has evolved slowly and in fits and starts, and 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, but it's actually going in the right direction and produces real dynamism. India has enormous problems, as we know, of still extreme poverty, mass unemployment, particularly in rural areas. But I get a very strong sense that the political will combined with sensible economic policy, will enable India to keep growing and in the right kind of way. Keeping a country of 1.4 billion people together and simultaneously accelerating development, ploughing more resources into health and education, into rural development. These are big things, right? They're not silver bullets. You press a button and these things happen. But I think there's an understanding now in India about what has to happen.
And you feel it's going to be the tortoise winning the race?
Well, the tortoise is galloping.
Great place to wind up our long discussion. I have a section called High Five India. Quick questions. India for you in one word.
Wonderful. I love it.
What is it about India that Britain and the world does not get?
Well, it doesn't get how the underlying dynamism and energy. It was once described as anarchy that works, and people see the anarchy, they don't see the working.
Do you think there is still colonial hangover in Westminster?
Well, there's a bit of it, I think. But the generation of people who were active when Britain ruled India, they've all died out. So in that direct connection, that's long since gone. I think a lot of people still haven't woken up to how big and relatively successful India's become, and see all the negatives and don't see the positives. I think there's an element of that, and a sort of nostalgia for a world which has long gone. I mean, the uncomfortable truth is that Britain had a very negative effect on Indian development, particularly in the 19th, early 20th centuries. The economy didn't grow, more than the population. India in 1947 was in a pretty desperate state. And the British have responsibility for that. Warm nostalgia isn't quite the right emotion. Yeah.
Since we are talking of Britain, if today the world was sitting at the dinner table, where would Britain be?
It's a middle power, and we should stop trying to pretend to be being a successful middle power. And Britain has a lot of good things going for it. It is where we are. Stop being pretentious. Britain made a terrible mistake when it left the European Union. We're in a weaker position, and gradually that problem is going to have to be sorted out. But I think providing we're realistic about our strengths and weaknesses, the country can go forward. The mood at the moment is awful and negative. There's a lot of self-flagellation going on, which isn't totally justified. I love my country. I wouldn't live anywhere else. And I see a lot of positive things. But we're no longer a great power. We should stop trying to be one.
Yes, that will help. Mental health with member parliaments. Do you think it's tough on MPs?
Well, it's a very stressful life. Can be a stressful life. I mean, of course, a lot of MPs don't do very much. As in other professions, they coast along. They've got a safe seat. But I think if you take it seriously and you really try to help your constituents, and you also try to take a high profile on topical issues, on legislation and campaigns, then you run into quite a lot of hostility, and you've got to be strong enough to deal with it. There are 650 almost MPs. They vary enormously. So some are utterly useless, some are wonderful. And one thing I would say about people in politics is that for the most part, they're people there out of public service. You know, there are some scandals, but the vast majority are always...
They want to do good.
They want to do good, and suffer from being constantly belittled. And
I do agree that.
Until that they're all corrupt or something. It's not remotely like that.
No, I totally agree. What has your wife of Goan descent taught you about India, which you could not find?
I discovered that, even Goan Christians have caste, and there's certain aspects of Indianness that never go away.
I met lovely Rachel. You still wear 2 rings. I found that fascinating.
Yes, well, one of the great joys of my life is I've had 2 very happy marriages to 2 wonderful women, and grateful for that.
Absolutely beautiful and brilliant. What is
Sir Vince Cable, now retired from politics, joyfully does?
Well, I think I have a very positive view on life. I'm 83 coming up, but I've got a vast agenda of things I want to do. Building on this work on China and India, I'm involved in businesses which are struggling, but I hope to make a success of. I'd spend a lot of time trying to keep fit.
Dancing?
I do my weekly dancing lessons, so I'm trying to be a 50-year-old in a 83-year-old body, which is it's a challenge, but it keeps me going.
Would you still get a 10 in ballroom dancing with your practice?
Yeah, I had a dancing exam last year, and I didn't get 10 out of 10, but it was highly commended.
If there was any dance that would describe the relationship where we are, what would the world be doing now?
Oh, it's very difficult to say, but my favorite is the foxtrot, which is kind of elegant. I'm learning the Argentine tango, which I absolutely love, and it's much more free-flowing and expressive, and less rehearsed in a way.
I think the world is doing Paso Doble at the moment.
Yeah, so that's one I'm not good at.
Great. Should we do a high five? Fabulous. Thank you very, very much. I've had the most illuminating conversation, and I must say that so much that I heard and I learned. You are a very, very open and a very, very balanced.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you.
And I've absolutely enjoyed it. Thank you
Thank you.
very much, Sir Vince Cable.
Sure.